The kind of storm that came that night wasn't meant for washing away dirt or watering crops. It was the kind of storm that felt like an omen, like the sky itself was grieving something unspeakable. The rain wasn't falling, it was attacking. It slammed against rooftops and roads like 1,000 fists. Every gust of wind bent the trees so low they looked like they might break under the pressure of the heavens. I should have hurried home like everyone else. I should have closed my shutters, latched my door, and let the thunder pass. But I took the long path instead, a choice that would unravel everything I thought I knew about strangers, loyalty, and fate. The path near the old market ruins had always been my shortcut through the village, though no one used it anymore. The stalls were long abandoned, the stone arches broken and scattered like forgotten bones. But even in the rain, even in the chaos, I saw him clearly. A figure hunched in the shadow of the main arch, his form barely distinguishable under the soaked fabric clinging to his skin. At first I assumed he was a drunk or a thief, or someone tossed from one of the nearby taverns. But then he raised his head just slightly, and my breath caught in my throat. He didn't look up all the way, not enough to reveal his face, but the way he moved didn't belong to a defeated man. There was a strange grace to him, even curled up in the cold. His posture wasn't slumped in shame or weakness, it was tense, controlled, like a coiled spring waiting to be released. Something primal stirred in me. Not fear exactly, but the kind of alertness a deer might feel in the woods when the forest goes suddenly silent. I don't know why I spoke to him. Maybe it was guilt, maybe curiosity, or maybe something in the air told me this man wasn't supposed to be here. Not in this storm. Not like this. "Are you all right?" I called out over the rain, my voice half swallowed by thunder. He didn't respond. He didn't even flinch. I stepped closer, boots squelching in the mud, and tried again. "Do you need shelter? You'll freeze to death out here." A long pause. Then, slowly, he lifted his head just enough for me to see part of his face. Pale, sharp-featured, soaked hair stuck to his skin, eyes dark and unreadable. He didn't speak, but he nodded once, and that was enough for me. I turned and began walking back toward my cottage. I didn't need to look back to know he was following. His footsteps were light, almost unnervingly quiet for someone his size. He followed 3 paces behind me the entire way, silent as the shadows, like a ghost with unfinished business. When we reached my home, I opened the door and stepped aside to let him in. He hesitated at the threshold, rain dripping from his cloak, before finally stepping into the warmth of the firelit room. He didn't sit. He didn't shake himself dry. He just stood there, taking in the space as if memorizing every detail. Offered him a towel and pointed toward the hearth. "You can dry off there. I'll bring you something warm." Still no reply, but he moved toward the fire, removed his cloak with calculated slowness, and sat down on the rug, his back unnaturally straight, his eyes never leaving the flames. I gave him a bowl of reheated lentil stew and watched as he accepted it without a word. He ate slowly, without mess, with an elegance that didn't belong in rags. He was a contradiction. Everything about him screamed dissonance. He looked like a beggar, but carried himself like a warrior. He didn't speak, but every glance was heavy with intent. He wasn't a man down on his luck. He was a man in hiding. As he ate, his gaze drifted toward the painting above my fireplace. It was an old piece, a depiction of the Valendor Palace before the uprising. My father had painted it from memory, back when the kingdom still stood tall and proud. I hadn't thought much about it in years, but he stared at it like he was looking at a grave. "You recognize it?" I asked softly. For a long moment he didn't answer. Then, just above a whisper, he said, "I used to walk those halls." I didn't know how to respond to that. Was it a metaphor? A lie? Or something more dangerous? "You're from the capital?" I asked. His eyes didn't leave the painting. Not anymore. That night I let him sleep by the hearth while I took the back room. I left a blanket for him and watched from the doorway as he carefully folded his cloak, positioned himself near the warmth, and closed his eyes. But not all the way. He slept like someone who expected enemies, even in dreams. I lay awake, heart restless, thoughts spiraling. Why had he said what he did? What did he mean by "used to walk those halls"? What was he running from? I stared at the ceiling until the fire had nearly gone out, until even the wind outside seemed exhausted. Just as my eyes began to close, I heard a voice, not loud, but unmistakable. "En Valendor," he whispered. And it wasn't said like a place. It was said like a memory, like a ghost, like a wound still bleeding. And I sat upright, blood frozen in my veins. He had just spoken the name of the fallen kingdom, a name erased from our books, forbidden in whispers. And he had spoken it inside my home. From the moment he stepped across my threshold, it was as if the air inside my house shifted into something heavier, older, almost sacred, carrying the weight of centuries that had no business living in a place as small and ordinary as mine. He did not behave like a man grateful for shelter, nor like one defeated by life's cruelties. Instead, every movement he made, from the way he lowered himself into the chair to the measured stillness with which he held his breath in the silence, radiated a discipline I had only ever read about in half-forgotten histories. He was not loud, not demanding, not intrusive, but his silence itself spoke louder than words. The kind of silence that made you feel as though you were sharing a roof with someone who once commanded armies, issued decrees, and now wore invisibility, like armor. The first night he stayed, I slept, lightly, half afraid of the presence in the other room. I expected to hear him stir restlessly, or rummage through my belongings, or even slip away into the storm like a shadow retreating to its lair. But when dawn broke, and I entered the main room, he was sitting by the ashes of the fire, posture as straight as stone, eyes wide open as though sleep was something he had long ago surrendered. I greeted him cautiously. He gave a nod, no more than that. When I handed him a bowl of porridge, he accepted it with both hands, formal, deliberate, and ate in silence. I noticed how he did not slouch, did not spill a drop, did not eat like a beggar desperate for survival. He ate like a soldier, steady, disciplined, as though each spoonful was part of a ritual. At first I thought it was simply his way, but as the days unfolded, I realized there was something much deeper, something unnerving, hidden in the quiet precision of his movements. He swept the floor without being asked, stacked the firewood in neat rows that burned twice as long as when I piled them, even mended a loose hinge on my door as though his hands had been trained for such tasks all his life. Yet his touch was never clumsy. It was refined, practiced, as though his life had once been surrounded by order, wealth, and discipline rather than chaos. And then there were his eyes, always alert, always watching. He noticed details others ignored, a loose thread on my sleeve, the faint crack in the wall near the window, the way the candle flickered when the door shifted in its frame. He was present, entirely and absolutely, in every moment. But what unsettled me most was how he looked at the painting above my hearth, the one of the Valendor Palace ruins. The painting had hung in my family home for as long as I could remember. To me it was a relic of a forgotten kingdom, a place spoken of only in half-truths and rumors, destroyed in rebellion, and swallowed by time. Most in our village never mentioned it. It was bad luck, too. But whenever he passed that painting, he lingered, not with curiosity, but with something heavier, recognition. I tested him once, speaking of politics as casually as one might comment on the weather. He listened, expression calm, until I mentioned the name Valendor. It was just a slip, a memory of the old festivals we used to hold in the town square when I was a child, before fear silenced such things. But the moment the word left my lips, I saw him falter. It was barely noticeable, the brief pause of a spoon halfway to his mouth, the tightening of his jaw, the stillness in his breath. But it was enough. The name had struck him like a stone to glass. I let it go, pretended not to notice. But later, when I stepped outside, I caught him crouched, near the well, tracing lines in the dirt with a stick. I crept closer, careful not to disturb him. He was drawing a map, not the current one, not the fractured provinces and scattered towns we all knew. This map had different borders, old names, the lion crest drawn faintly at the edge. It was the map of Valandor, as it had been before the fall. When he realized I was watching, he swept his hand across the dirt, erasing it. His face betrayed nothing, but his silence screamed. That night, as the fire crackled low, I asked him gently, "Where are you from?" For a long moment he stared at the flames. Then he said so softly I almost missed it, "If a man loses his name, does he lose himself?" I didn't know how to answer. His words sat between us like a riddle, and I understood then. He wasn't hiding only from the world. He was hiding from himself. Over time, his questions turned to me, about my family, the loyalties of our town, the neighbors and their politics. It wasn't idle curiosity. He was gathering information, building a web of trust and threat in his mind. He wanted to know who could be relied upon, who might betray, and who still whispered the old names of Valandor in secret. Despite myself, I began to trust him. There was something magnetic about his quiet presence, something that made the loneliness of my home feel less suffocating. We shared meals, unspoken routines, even silence that no longer felt heavy. In the stillness, companionship grew. Fragile, unexplainable, but real. Then, one evening, I found him standing once more in front of the painting of the Valandor Palace. The firelight flickered across his face, casting shadows that made him look both older and impossibly young. He stood so still, it was as though time itself had paused for him. I stepped beside him, the question unspoken, but alive in my eyes. He didn't turn, didn't move. "I wasn't always no one," he said finally, voice low and trembling with a weight that chilled me. My breath caught. "Once," he continued, eyes locked on the painted ruins, "I was everything." The words struck me harder than any confession could. He didn't sound boastful, or mad, or lost in fantasy. He sounded truthful, certain, as if he had finally allowed me to glimpse the shadow of who he truly was. And in that moment, I believed him. He wasn't just a beggar. He wasn't just a stranger. He was a fallen king in hiding, and I had invited him into my home. Even in silence, royalty reveals itself, and his silence screams heritage. It wasn't in the words he chose, for he rarely spoke them, but in the way he moved, the way he occupied space, the way even my humble cottage seemed to bend around him like it was being forced to remember a grandeur long gone. There are some men who beg, some men who fight, and some who lead even when no one has agreed to follow them. He was the last kind, and though he sat by my fire dressed in rags, his presence carried the echo of crowns and thrones that history swore were dust. At first, I told myself I was imagining it. The way he sat so straight-backed, never leaning, never slouching, as though invisible eyes were always upon him, ready to judge. The way he ate, not hungrily, not greedily, but with the exact patience of a man who had always been taught that meals were not merely for nourishment, but for ritual. He lifted each spoonful with measured grace, paused between bites, and finished precisely when the bowl was empty. Not before, not after. It was strange to me how someone who had claimed to have nothing left carried himself like someone who had once been told the world was his. Days passed, and the stranger, the beggar, the guest, the ghost of the storm, became a quiet rhythm in my home. He fixed things without being asked, but not in the careless way a neighbor might. My broken chair, which had wobbled for months, stood solid after his touch. The loose shutters that banged in the wind were tightened so perfectly They no longer whispered in the night. He even repaired the hinge of my father's old chest, polishing the wood as though it deserved respect, not utility. He didn't brag. He didn't seek thanks. He simply moved with the quiet precision of someone who understood that order was not optional. It was survival. But what began to unsettle me most were his words, when he chose to speak. Once, while I was chopping vegetables, I muttered an old village saying, something about patience and rain. Without thinking, he corrected me. "That isn't how the proverb goes," he said softly. "It's, patience breaks storms before storms break men." I froze. That wasn't a saying common folk used. That was an ancient royal proverb, one my grandfather used to whisper when telling us bedtime stories about kings and courts. I laughed it off, pretending I hadn't noticed the slip. But then came another moment. I made a casual comment about the last Valandor War, something I'd heard in school, that the siege of Calbrith had lasted only 3 weeks. His eyes flicked to mine. 3 weeks, he said, his voice low, almost offended. No, 42 days. The walls held until the 3rd moon. They always did. He said it not as though he'd read it in a book, but as though he'd been there. The pieces began to fit together in ways I didn't want them to. One night, while fetching water, I caught him in the corner of the room, holding something I hadn't seen touched in years, my father's old sword. Rusted, heavy, more relic than weapon. He cradled it with reverence, as though it weren't scrap metal but something holy. His thumb traced the faded crest etched into the hilt, the lion with a broken crown. He whispered under his breath, "Valandor steel endures, even when men do not." I hadn't told him where the sword came from. My father had fought in the rebellion years ago, carrying that blade across. Battles most of the village never spoke of. To him, it was memory. To this stranger, it was history alive again. Later, I began testing him without admitting it. I asked about old locations using their modern names. He would answer, sometimes absently, sometimes reluctantly. But he always used the old ones. Where I said Iron Vale, he said Caradon. Where I said the Western Pass, he corrected, no, Lion's Gate. These were names erased from maps decades ago, names only scholars or survivors of Valandor would remember. Each slip was small, each correction subtle, but together they built a truth too heavy to ignore. At night, when he thought I wasn't watching, I saw him by the firelight sketching patterns on scraps of wood, the sigil of the lion crown, the outline of Valandor's palace. I had seen similar sketches in the town archives, drawn by survivors who still whispered of the prince who had vanished when the kingdom burned. The missing prince, Elion. The boy who had vanished into smoke and blood, never confirmed dead, never confirmed alive. Stories said he was lost in the fire. Others whispered he had fled. Some claimed he was executed in secret. But the older villagers, the ones who still lit candles on certain nights of the year, always swore, "The lion sleeps, but the lion wakes again." And now, he was in my house. I knew it, but I couldn't bring myself to say it aloud. What if I was wrong? What if I shattered the fragile trust between us? But the more I watched him, the more the truth pressed against my ribs, demanding to be spoken. The way he never sat with his back to the door. The way he spoke of loyalty like it was currency. The way his gaze sometimes wandered to the horizon, sharp and aching, like a man waiting for a land that no longer existed. It had to be him. Finally, one evening, I couldn't keep it inside. He sat across from me, the fire between us, shadows dancing across his sharp features. My heart thundered in my chest, but the words slipped out before I could stop them. "Are you Prince Elion?" I asked. The silence that followed was suffocating. He didn't move, didn't breathe. The fire cracked, sparks rising, and still he only stared at me. I expected denial, anger, maybe even laughter. But instead he leaned forward, his eyes colder than the storm that had first brought him to me. That name, he said at last, voice like iron dragged across stone, nearly got me killed. He leaned closer, lowering his voice until it was almost a whisper. Don't speak it aloud again. The fire flickered, shadows splitting across his face like broken crowns. My breath caught as the truth hung unspoken between us, not denied, not claimed, but alive. He wasn't just a beggar. He wasn't just a stranger. He was the heir of a kingdom buried in ash. And now I knew the secret that others had killed to silence. Truth has a way of bleeding through even the strongest disguises. No matter how carefully he held himself, no matter how tightly he bound his silence, the cracks were beginning to show. And in those cracks, I saw glimpses of the man history had buried. His disguise wasn't failing because he was careless. It was failing because the weight of who he had been was too great to contain. Some truths live so loudly that even exile cannot silence them, and night after night I could feel his past pressing against the walls of my home, demanding to be seen. The firelight cast long shadows one evening as I entered the room and found him hunched over a book I hadn't touched in years. An old worn volume of history my father once used to lecture us about kingdoms and rebellions. He wasn't merely skimming. His eyes devoured each page like a starving man rediscovering bread. His fingers traced the symbols drawn on the parchment, royal crests, banners, the lineages of dynasties long gone. When I stepped closer, I noticed where he lingered. Not on the stories of battles or victories, but on the details of heraldry. His gaze moved carefully over each sigil, the eagle of Southreach, the serpent of Durnvale, the lion crown of Valandor. His jaw tightened whenever his eyes landed on that last one. You know those well, I said softly, careful not to startle him. He closed the book with deliberate calm. Better than I'd like, he muttered. I thought the moment had passed. But then he reopened it, flipping quickly until he reached a section I barely remembered. The names of the men and women branded as traitors after the rebellion. Faces sketched in ink, accused of betrayal, collaboration, cowardice. His body stilled. His hand gripped the edge of the page until the paper nearly tore. You recognize them? I said quietly. He didn't answer at first. His eyes locked on one name, one face. And though his lips didn't move, I could see the storm rising in him. Finally he spoke, his voice low, ragged, like it was being dragged across old wounds. What would you do, he asked, if your own brother sold you to your enemies? The question hollowed me out. My tongue stuck to the roof of my mouth. This wasn't hypothetical. This was confession disguised as inquiry. I swallowed hard. I don't know, I whispered. I'd like to think I'd forgive him, but truthfully, I'd carry it until it killed me. His eyes flicked to mine. For the first time, I saw not just strength, but sorrow, the kind that shapes a man deeper than any crown. Without another word, he pulled back the sleeve of his shirt. I gasped. There, carved across his shoulder, was a scar, deep, jagged, unmistakable. The kind left not by accident, but by steel, meant to kill. This, he said, his tone steady but his eyes haunted, was the night the palace burned. I was meant to die with the rest. The room seemed to shrink around me. He reached beneath his collar then, fingers steady despite the tremor in his voice. From beneath the rough fabric of his shirt, he pulled out a chain, and dangling from it, catching the firelight with quiet authority, was a crest I had only ever seen in drawings. The lion crown of Valandor. I froze. My breath caught. There it was. Undeniable proof of what I had suspected, of what I had feared to believe. The missing prince, the exiled heir, the man whose name still haunted whispers across the land, was sitting in my home, wearing his birthright hidden against his chest. He didn't show it with pride. He didn't flaunt it. He revealed it like a confession, a burden he could no longer carry alone. I keep it hidden, he said quietly, because anyone who sees it, sees a target. I sat across from him, trembling, trying to find words. "Why me?" I asked finally. "Why tell me?" He leaned forward, the fire between us painting his face in shifting gold and shadow. "Because secrets rot when they have no soil. And you—" He hesitated, searching my face. "You don't want anything from me. That's rarer than loyalty these days." We spoke long into the night, about loyalty, about identity, about survival. He told me pieces of the truth, never the full story, but enough to stitch together a picture of betrayal and survival that made my chest ache. He spoke of his mother's final words. "Trust the people, not the throne." He spoke of the coup, of flames licking the palace walls, of running barefoot through corridors filled with smoke, of men he'd once called uncle raising swords against him. He spoke of the years since, of hiding in shadows, of watching allies fall, of never daring to say his name aloud. "I am not who they say I am," he whispered at one point, his hands tightening around the chain. "But I am not no one either. And one day, I must choose which lie to live." I didn't know what to say, so I did the only thing I could. I told him he wasn't alone anymore. From that night on, I became more than a host. I became a confidant, a co-conspirator. I helped him draft coded messages, letters written in metaphors and symbols, meant for allies who might still be alive, hidden across the provinces. We used my father's old parchment, his ink, his books. By day, I lived my ordinary life. By night, I sat beside the exiled Prince of Valandor, helping him weave the first fragile threads of a web meant to bring a kingdom back from ashes. But trust is a dangerous seed. It grows roots even where danger lies thick. One evening, as we worked by candlelight, he rose suddenly and crossed the room. He knelt by the far corner, the one where the floor always creaked, and pressed his palm flat against the boards. With a sound like a sigh, the wood shifted, the floor lifted. Beneath it, darkness, a tunnel, a secret vein running beneath my cottage that I had never known existed. I stared, stunned. He met my eyes, and for the first time, I saw not just sorrow, not just secrecy, but the fire of resolve. "They'll come for me soon," he said, his voice low, steady. "And they'll expect me to be alone." The air seemed to vanish from the room as his words sank in. He wasn't just hiding anymore. He was preparing. Preparing for war, for reckoning, for the day when the lion crown would roar again. And now, whether I wanted it or not, I was no longer a bystander. I was standing at the mouth of the tunnel, staring into the darkness of a destiny that was no longer his alone. The air grew colder with every step we took, so cold that it bit into my skin and seemed to pierce straight through my chest, and the torchlight in his hand sputtered, as though it too feared the suffocating silence pressing in on us, shadows crawling across the stone walls like restless spirits, until at last, the narrow corridor widened, and there before us loomed a vault so immense, so impossibly carved with symbols that seemed to throb faintly in the light, that I felt my entire body tremble with the knowledge that he was about to reveal what no outsider had been allowed to see for years. The buried heart of a kingdom, long thought dead. The door rose above us like the gate of another world, its surface etched with marks I could not read, yet felt deep in my veins as though my very blood remembered them. My hand lifted almost against my will, my fingertips brushing the stone, and the instant I touched it, a shiver surged through me, so violent and sudden that I gasped. He pressed his palm firmly against the surface beside mine, and for a moment nothing happened, until the silence broke with a low groan that rattled the chamber. Stone ground against stone, gears hidden in darkness stirred awake, and dust fell like ash as the massive vault began to open with the slow inevitability of fate itself. A gust of air, stale and heavy with the scent of parchment, rust, and something older than memory itself rushed over us. When the torchlight spilled inside, my breath caught, Banners of crimson and gold lay furled in the shadows, dulled by time, but still proud. Armor stood propped like silent soldiers, their surfaces tarnished but unbroken. Chests filled with scrolls and documents lined the walls, sealed with wax that had not been broken in decades. It was not a treasury. It was a kingdom's memory, locked away, untouched, waiting to speak again. He stepped inside first, his expression reverent and tormented all at once, his hand trembling as it hovered above the relics. "No one alive has seen this," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Not since the night everything was taken from us." He lifted a scroll with care, unsealing it with hands that shook more from grief than age. The ink, though faded, revealed decrees, treaties, names of rulers whose legacies had been burned from history. Then he placed another document into my hands, heavier than the rest, his voice cracking as he said, "This proves who I am, my blood, my curse, my right." The words blurred before my eyes, yet the truth was clear. He was not just a survivor, but the heir to a broken throne. His shoulders shook as he turned from me. "The massacre came in one night. My family slaughtered. My mother tried to shield me, but I would not be here if not for a knight who defied death itself to smuggle me away. They all died. For me." His voice faltered, breaking. "And I did nothing. Nothing." The vault, once majestic, now felt like a tomb heavy with his guilt. My chest ached as I watched him, a man who carried not pride in his lineage, but torment for surviving it. Then my gaze fell to a small chest hidden near the armor. Compelled by something I couldn't name, I opened it, finding a silk-wrapped letter whose seal had weakened with time. The handwriting across its surface was elegant, unmistakably royal. I unfolded it, and the first line nearly drove me to my knees, because it spoke my name. My heart thundered, my breath came ragged. How could a queen, dead for decades, have written words meant for me? As I read, the truth shattered everything I thought I knew. She spoke of a promise made to her most trusted guard, a man of unyielding loyalty who had sworn not only to protect her son, but to safeguard the generations that would come after. That man was my grandfather. Tears blurred my vision. My family had carried this vow in silence, never speaking of it, burying it as deeply as this vault. And yet, here it was, written in the Queen's own hand, binding my fate to his. When I lifted my gaze, he was staring at me as if seeing me for the first time. His eyes glistened with disbelief and recognition. "It was always meant to be," he whispered. "Our fates, tied, long before we met." The letter trembled in my grip, my heart beating with the weight of destiny pressing down on me. I was no longer a bystander to his story. I was woven into it, my blood carrying a vow as old as his grief. He stepped closer, reaching into a smaller chest, and when his hand emerged, it held a silver ring, dulled with age, yet glimmering faintly in the firelight. He placed it into my palm, his voice breaking as he whispered, "This once belonged to the Queen's shield-bearer, and now it belongs to you. Peace, I have learned, is never more fragile than when it dares to linger in the home of someone hiding a throne beneath their kitchen floor. And on that night, when the quiet wrapped around the cottage like a blanket too soft to trust, I should have known it would not last, because peace is only ever the silence before the storm comes crashing down to claim everything you love. I was half asleep when it began, lulled by the creak of the old wooden beams overhead and the faint whistle of the wind through the shutters. But then came the sound that wrenched me back into waking terror. Boots, heavy and many, stomping against the earth with purpose. Shouts followed, sharp and commanding, the kind of voices that belonged not to neighbors or travelers, but to men trained to hunt. My blood froze as the first crash sounded against the door, the hinges groaning under the assault, and in that instant I knew the life I had known within these walls had ended. He was already moving, pulling me to my feet with urgency, his eyes wide but not surprised. "They've found us," he hissed, and though fear burned in his gaze, beneath it lay something colder. Preparation. He had been expecting this. My heart hammered as he dragged me across the kitchen, his hand sweeping a rug aside to reveal the trap door that led into the tunnel. Another crash against the door splintered the wood, shouts growing louder, closer. We descended into the darkness just as the front door gave way, light spilling into the room above as boots thundered across the floor. I bit down on my scream, the sound clawing at my throat, but he pressed a hand to my mouth and shook his head, his expression commanding silence. In the suffocating dark of the tunnel, we moved quickly, guided only by the faint light of the torch he carried, the walls pressing close around us as though the earth itself was trying to smother us. When at last we emerged through the far end of the passage, the night air hit me like a shock, cold and sharp, and we stumbled into the trees just as the sound of glass shattering erupted behind us. From the tree line, hidden in the shadows, I turned back to look at my home. Flames had begun to bloom inside the windows, spreading hungrily across the beams and walls, until the cottage that had been my refuge, my history, my sanctuary, was consumed. The fire raged against the night sky, and I stood frozen, my heart breaking as every memory I had within those walls turned to ash before my eyes. He stood beside me, his jaw clenched, fury written across every line of his face. "They tracked me through you," he muttered, not accusing, but resigned, as if this was the cost he had always known he would pay. His fists tightened, and for the first time I saw the dangerous fire in him, not just grief and guilt, but anger sharpened into resolve. Before I could ask what he meant, he pulled a folded piece of parchment from within his cloak, its edges creased from being handled too many times. He thrust it into my hands, his voice low and hard. "I intercepted this before it reached them. It was meant for the rebels." My breath caught as I unfolded the letter, the firelight from the burning cottage casting just enough glow for me to make out the words. My eyes widened, my stomach twisting violently. My name was there, written in bold strokes, not as a bystander, but as a target. I staggered back, the ground uneven beneath my feet. Why is my name here?" My voice cracked, tears welling as the weight of what I was seeing sank into me. For years I had thought myself hidden, ordinary, a shadow to the world beyond my village, but the letter told a truth I wasn't ready to face. They knew me. They wanted me, and the safety I had clung to was nothing but an illusion. He stepped closer, his hand gripping my shoulder, his eyes burning with the intensity of someone who had already lived too long with such truths. "Because they know who you are now. They know what you carry." His voice was hoarse, yet each word struck with the weight of inevitability. I shook my head, unable to believe, unwilling to accept that my life, my family, my very name had been tangled in this war long before I understood it. Yet as the flames roared louder, devouring the home that had once been my world, I realized there was no denying it anymore. I was no longer just a witness to his story. I was bound to it, in blood and in fate. And now, there was no turning back. He leaned in close, his whisper cutting through the crackle of fire and the shouts of men combing the forest behind us. "They're not just hunting me anymore," he said, his gaze locked on mine with terrifying certainty. "You've become part of the war. A fortress built on fear is still nothing more than a cage, and though the hilltop tower rose like a guardian over the valley, its stone walls thick enough to defy even the fiercest storms, I could not shake the feeling that every step I took inside it echoed not with safety, but with warning, as if the stones themselves whispered that refuge and captivity are sometimes one and the same. The tower had long been abandoned, its windows choked with ivy, its stairways coated in dust thick enough to record every footprint we left behind. But in his eyes it was not ruin, it was opportunity. We cleared rooms one by one, sweeping out debris, sealing shutters, stacking crates of supplies in corners where the damp would not spoil them. At night we took turns keeping watch from the battlements, scanning the valley below for torchlight or movement. He showed me how to listen for patterns in the wind, how the forest carried sound upward, how even a single misplaced branch crack could betray the presence of someone hiding in the dark. Days bled into weeks, and routine became both a comfort and a chain. Each morning he woke me before sunrise, dragging me into the courtyard where the grass still clung stubbornly to life between cracks of stone. There, under the pale light, he placed a wooden staff in my hands and taught me to block, to strike, to move with rhythm rather than panic. At first I stumbled, breathless, my arms trembling from the weight, but his voice was relentless, urging me past exhaustion, past fear, until the staff no longer felt foreign in my grip but an extension of my body. When I mastered the basics, he placed blades in my hands, smaller at first, then heavier, until the clatter of steel in the courtyard became as familiar to me as the sound of my own heartbeat. But defense was only the beginning. In the afternoons, he shifted our lessons to something I had never imagined myself learning: codes, signals, and the quiet art of espionage. He taught me how to read letters for hidden meanings, how to disguise my own words so they carried truths only to those who knew how to look for them, how to vanish in plain sight simply by moving as though I belonged wherever I stood. It was grueling, and I resented him for it in the beginning. My muscles ached, my eyes burned from sleepless nights, and more than once I accused him of preparing me for a war I had never chosen. He listened in silence, his expression unreadable, but when my anger broke into tears, he would quietly hand me water, wait until I steadied, and then say only, "You have to survive this, not just for me, for yourself." Yet within the tension of discipline, something else grew. In the rare moments when the training ended and the silence between us softened, I began to see the boy who had lost everything beneath the weight of his bloodline, the man who had lived every day since in exile, carrying a name that was both shield and curse. He laughed once, softly, when I tripped during a sparring drill, and the sound startled me, because it had been so long since I had heard anything light pass his lips. I found myself looking for those cracks in his armor, moments when grief gave way to something gentler, something almost human. But the tower was never meant to be only for us. Night after night, he worked tirelessly at a desk in one of the cleared chambers, sending messages written in ink that vanished when heated, dispatching them by hawk to allies scattered across the land. Some days replies came back swiftly, brief confirmations that the old bonds had not entirely been severed. Other times, silence stretched for weeks, the unanswered calls gnawing at our patience. Each silence was its own kind of betrayal, and though he never admitted it, I saw how the weight pressed on him, how he paced the tower walls with fists clenched tighter every day. Then, at last, one reply came that changed everything. The parchment was creased, the ink hurried, but its message was clear enough to steal the breath from my chest. "The Queen's line lives." I stared at the words, my hands trembling, and when I lifted my gaze to him, I found his eyes locked on me, unblinking, searching for something he had not dared to believe. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The fire crackled in the hearth, the wind rattled the shutters, and in that silence, I felt the tower shift around us, no longer just stone and shadow, but the fragile beginnings of something larger, something dangerous. He stepped closer, the parchment still clutched in his hand, and though the firelight danced across his face, his gaze burned with an intensity that left me breathless. "You're not just my protector anymore," he said, his voice low, certain, and heavy with the weight of destiny. "You're my only chance." Sometimes the knife that sinks deepest into your back is carried not by an enemy cloaked in shadows, but by a hand you once trusted, a voice you once laughed, with a face tied to your childhood memories, and it was this cruel truth that weighed on me the night we received word of a gathering in the north. A noble council cloaked in promises of allegiance but reeking, from the moment the message arrived, of trap and betrayal. The parchment had been delivered in secrecy, its seal unmarked, its words polished to sound like opportunity. Lords and ladies meeting in an ancient hall to discuss the rising unrest, a chance to plead his cause and secure allies before the rebels closed their fists around the kingdom. Yet as Elion read it aloud, his jaw tightened, his eyes scanning the lines again and again, not with hope, but suspicion. "It's bait," he muttered, his voice low and edged with anger. "They want me to come. They want me to step into their snare." The fire snapped between us, throwing sparks into the air, and though my chest tightened with dread, another part of me stirred with reckless resolve. If it was a trap, then perhaps it was not his place to walk into it. Perhaps it was mine. "Then let me go," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "If they expect you, they won't expect me." His head snapped toward me, disbelief flashing in his eyes, followed by something fiercer. Fear. "Absolutely not. You don't know what you'd be walking into." "I know enough," I answered, though my heart hammered wildly. "You trained me for this. You said yourself I have to survive, that I have to carry this as much as you do. Let me prove it." For a long moment he stared at me, and the silence between us was as heavy as the stone walls of our tower. At last, he turned away, his shoulders rigid, his voice a whisper. "If you go, you may not return." "I'll return," I said, though inside I wasn't sure. But I could not let him go, not when the noose was tightening, not when every instinct told me the trap had been laid for him, and not for me. The journey north was a blur of cold nights and wary footsteps, every inn and crossroad watched with suspicion, every traveler a potential enemy. By the time I reached the hall, its spires rising like skeletal fingers into the gray sky, I had convinced myself that my presence there was both brave and foolish, that one wrong move would end not only me, but everything we had built. The gathering was grander than I had expected, nobles cloaked in furs and velvet, their laughter echoing against the vaulted ceilings, goblets of wine raised as though the kingdom was not rotting at its core. I moved carefully among them, head bowed, ears sharpened, listening for whispers. And then, in the swirl of voices, I heard it, a sound I hadn't heard in years, but one my heart knew instantly. My cousin's voice. I froze. My cousin, the girl who had shared summers with me by the river, who had stolen apples with me in the market, who had been the closest thing to a sister I had ever known. But her voice was lower now, sharper, laced with the edge of secrecy. I followed it through the throng until I saw her, cloaked in crimson, speaking in hushed tones to a man whose face I did not recognize. And then the words struck me like a blade. My name. My blood went cold. She was the one who had spoken it. She was the one who had exposed me. The room swayed, my stomach churning, and before I knew it, I had stepped closer, my voice breaking the careful mask I had meant to keep. "Why?" She turned, her eyes widening, horror flashing across her face as though she had seen a ghost. For a moment she faltered, reaching toward me, her lips trembling. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, desperation shaking her voice. "You have to run." My anger surged, but beneath it was the old ache of betrayal, of love turned sharp. "You gave them my name. You put the fire at my door." Tears welled in her eyes, her hands trembling. "I didn't want to. I didn't know what they would do. I thought—" Her voice broke. "Please, you don't understand. It isn't just him they're hunting. It's worse. It's his brother. The prince's own brother is leading the hunt." Her words struck me harder than any blow. The betrayal was not only hers, it was at the very heart of the bloodline itself. I staggered back, my mind reeling. If Elion's own brother had turned, then the war was not just rebellion. It was family tearing itself apart from within. I left her standing there, her pleas echoing behind me, my chest burning with fury, grief, and a fear I had never known before. The journey back to the tower was a blur of shadows and pounding footsteps, every thought consumed by the revelation clawing at me. When I burst into the chamber, Elion rose sharply, his eyes searching me for wounds, for answers. I pressed the words into the air, my voice shaking. "It's your brother. He's the one. He's leading them." For a long moment he said nothing, his face still as stone, his eyes locked on mine with an intensity that chilled me. Then, at last, he exhaled, the sound heavy as though carrying years of buried truth. "I knew it," he said softly, bitterly. But I couldn't admit it. We didn't ride for survival that night. We rode for the truth, a truth sharp enough to wound us both, and as the moon hung pale and watchful over the empty fields, its silver light stretching across the earth like a road carved by fate itself, I felt in my bones that every hoofbeat was carrying us not farther from danger, but closer to the revelation that would decide everything. We left the tower before dawn, cloaked as weary travelers, our faces shadowed, our belongings strapped to tired horses whose breath steamed in the cold air. He had chosen the disguises carefully. Patched cloaks, travel-stained packs, dust rubbed deliberately into the seams of our boots. But still I could feel the eyes of the world on us, as though every passing crow and every stirring branch might betray who we were. The air was heavy with the weight of pursuit, and though the road stretched empty before us, I knew the silence behind us could shatter at any moment. By the time the first patrol appeared, my heart had already been racing for hours. We saw them before they saw us, rebels, armed and restless, their torches cutting through the mist like knives. My pulse hammered in my throat as their shouts rose, their horses surging forward, and for a moment I thought we were finished. But Elion's hand was steady on the reins, his eyes sharp, his voice calm as he urged us toward a narrow ravine half hidden by the undergrowth. The descent was treacherous, stones slipping beneath the hooves, but the rebels thundered past above, their curses fading into the night. Only when silence returned did I dare to breathe, my body trembling with the closeness of death. We pressed onward, avoiding the main roads, crossing rivers where the water bit into our legs with icy teeth, forcing our way through backwoods where the trees seemed to close around us, their branches clawing at our cloaks. The journey carved us down to our rawest selves, every mile stripping away comfort until all that remained was grit, exhaustion, and the relentless drive to keep moving. Through old villages we rode, places still scarred by the war, where charred beams jutted skyward like broken bones, where children watched us with hollow eyes from doorways, their silence louder than any cry. I felt the weight of their stares, the judgment in their gaze, as if they knew who we were, as if they had already measured the worth of our cause and found it wanting. Each ruin we passed whispered of a promise broken, a kingdom betrayed, and I wondered if truth was worth the ashes it left behind. The western outpost came into view at last, a crumbling fortress clinging to the edge of a cliff, its walls battered but still standing, a stubborn reminder of loyalty, long thought dead. My heart pounded as we approached, because this was not just stone and mortar. This was where his last loyal general lived, the man who had once carried his banner across battlefields. But loyalty was not the same as memory. As we rode into the courtyard, soldiers sprang from the shadows, bows raised, steel glinting in the moonlight. And at their head stood a weathered man whose face was carved with scars and years, his eyes hard, his bowstring taut, the arrow aimed straight at Elion's chest. The silence stretched sharp as a blade. My breath hitched, my hand fumbling at my side, but before I could speak, the torchlight caught the silver ring on my finger. The general's eyes flicked to it, and for the first time his mask of fury cracked. His weapon lowered, his knees buckled, and in a motion heavy with reverence, he dropped to the ground before us. The courtyard fell silent, the soldiers frozen in disbelief as the old warrior bowed his head and spoke words that made the night itself tremble. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice raw, with emotion. "The time has come. Every kingdom must face its final reckoning, and ours came not beneath banners or in blazing daylight, but beneath the cold shimmer of moonlight on steel, where the walls of the old capital fortress rose above us like a judgment we could not escape, daring us to step inside and claim what blood had promised, yet fate had denied." The city lay cloaked in silence when we arrived, our faces hidden beneath hoods, our cloaks ragged, disguises meant to blur us into the weary refugees who now filled the streets. But I could not walk its cobblestones without feeling the ghosts pressing close. The laughter of children that once rang from market stalls, the music that had filled courtyards, now replaced with shadows and fear. Elion walked beside me, his stride steady, but I could see the storm gathering in his eyes with every step closer to the fortress where his brother sat on a stolen throne. It was not only disguise that carried us forward. It was the hidden web of allies still loyal to the old crown. They met us in silence, a candle in a shuttered window, a hand guiding us through a locked door, a whisper in the dark of stairwells that wound beneath the city streets. Piece by piece, the fortress yielded its secrets, and with every turn, I felt the weight of centuries pressing down, as though the stones themselves knew that this night would decide whether they still belonged to traitors or kings. When we emerged into the great hall, the torches blazed high, throwing light across the banners of a kingdom twisted to serve a new master. And at the far end of the chamber, standing tall, regal, and cold, was his brother. Their eyes met across the hall, and the silence cracked with tension thick enough to choke me. "Elion," his brother said, his voice smooth, mocking, heavy with betrayal. "You should have stayed buried. The world had already forgotten you. And you," Elion spat, stepping forward, his hand already tightening on the hilt of his sword, "should have died with our family, instead of slaughtering them." The words struck like blades. His brother's mask of calm faltered for only a heartbeat, but then his smirk returned. "I survived, because I had the will to do what you never could. I claimed what was abandoned, and the kingdom is mine now." The hall erupted as steel flashed, guards rushing forward, some with eyes hard in loyalty to the brother, others hesitating, torn by the sight of the man they once swore oaths to protect. The clash of blades rang against the walls, sparks flying as steel met steel. Allies we had smuggled inside rose from the shadows, turning the battle into chaos, the hall echoing with the cries of the loyal and the damned. Elion's sword met his brother's in the center of the hall, the sound sharp and ringing, each strike fueled not only by skill, but by years of rage, grief, and betrayal. They moved like mirrored storms, every blow meant to kill, every dodge desperate defiance of death. I watched, heart pounding, torn between awe and terror, as the two heirs of a broken crown fought not just for the throne, but for the right to claim survival itself. When Elion's blade finally forced his brother to his knees, the torches casting shadows across his face twisted with fury. I felt the breath leave my chest. His arm raised, sword gleaming, ready to end it, to silence his brother's betrayal forever. And in that instant, something inside me screamed. I ran forward, my hands catching his wrist, my voice breaking. "No, if you kill him now, you'll be no different than him." For a moment, time froze. His brother's chest heaved with ragged breaths, his eyes burning with hatred, but also glinting with something else. A secret that had waited for this very moment. A cruel smile twisted his lips as he looked at me, ignoring the blade still pressed to his throat. "You'll never hold the crown," he said, his voice a venomous whisper that cut through the chaos of the hall. His eyes locked onto mine, and the words that followed shattered the world around me. "Because she's the true heir." I never wanted a crown. I had never dreamt of the cold metal pressing into my brow, the heavy weight of jewels that felt more like chains than treasures. And yet on that night, when truth finally tore through the lies of bloodlines and betrayals, I understood that sometimes it is not you who chooses the crown. It is the crown that chooses you, dragging you into its grasp, whether your heart longs for it or not. The revelation struck like thunder, the hall still ringing with the echo of his brother's words. She's the true heir. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to tilt beneath my feet, the torches blurring, the cries of battle fading into silence as every eye in the fortress turned toward me. I wanted to deny it, to push the words away, but then came the proof. Scrolls brought forth by those who had risked everything to preserve them, faded seals bearing the crest of the old monarchy, documents that traced my bloodline back not to whispers, but to the queen herself, her sister's daughter, her niece. My hands trembled as I held the parchment, as though the ink itself burned into my skin, branding me with a truth I could not escape. The council gathered in the ruined chamber the next day, their voices sharp with tension, their faces carved with suspicion and hope in equal measure. Some refused to believe, clinging to the idea that Elion alone bore the rightful claim. Others looked at me with something more dangerous, expectation. When the votes were cast, the air held its breath. And then, one by one, the decision was spoken aloud. The monarchy would be restored, and it would be restored under me. I turned to Elion, my heart breaking with the weight of what this meant. His face was unreadable, but in his eyes I saw the storm of pride and sorrow colliding. When the chamber quieted, he stepped forward, his voice steady, though it trembled at the edges. "The crown was never mine to wear," he said, each word like a blade cutting through the silence. "It belongs to her." And so it was that I, who had once been a nameless girl in a village cottage, found myself standing in the throne room of a palace reduced to rubble and memory. The walls were cracked, the banners scorched, the floor littered with scars of battles past. Yet they crowned me there all the same. The weight of the circlet pressed into my brow, heavy, unyielding, and when I opened my eyes, I saw not grandeur, but the faces of those who had suffered, who now looked at me not as a stranger, but as their last hope. Elion stood beside me, not as king, but as protector, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword, his gaze scanning the hall for danger even as the people raised their voices in a cheer that shook the broken stones. Their cries of triumph thundered against the walls, but beneath it all I felt the ache of wounds not yet healed, scars that no crown, no ceremony, could erase. This was not a fairy tale coronation. It was a fragile attempt to stitch together a kingdom that had bled too long. And as the cheer rose, my heart whispered the truth I dared not speak. I was not ready, but readiness no longer mattered. The crown had chosen me, and with it came enemies I had not yet seen. When the ceremony ended and the crowd began to disperse, Elion approached, his expression grave. He pressed the royal seal into my palm, the cold metal heavy with history and warning. "You'll need this more than I ever did," he said, his voice low and certain. His eyes locked on mine, hard with truth. "They'll come for you now." A crown weighs heaviest not when it is forged of gold and jewels, but when it is worn for others, for every widow who mourns in silence, for every child who has known hunger, for every soldier whose blood soaks the earth. And from the first dawn of my reign, I understood that this crown was not mine to claim as triumph, but mine to carry as burden, a promise etched into my very soul. The work began immediately. The palace, still scarred by fire and ruin, became a hive of motion as craftsmen repaired the shattered stones, as banners of crimson and gold once more unfurled across the walls. Trade routes that had long withered were reopened, caravans cautiously returning with grain, fabric, and iron. Messengers rode to villages that had grown used to silence, bringing decrees that spoke of justice, of peace, of restoration. For the first time in years, The kingdom dared to breathe. But peace was not simply a matter of trade and walls. It was memory. It was grief. And I could not rule without honoring what had been lost. Across the capital, we raised memorials, stone pillars etched with names, fathers, mothers, children, knights, whose lives had been torn away in the coup. I stood before each one, laying my hand against the cool stone, whispering that their sacrifice had not been forgotten, that their voices would echo in every decision I made. And though the people cheered when they saw me walk among them, I saw in their eyes the shadows that lingered, the wounds that no crown could ever fully heal. Through it all, Elion remained at my side, but not in the open light. Where I stood in the throne room, he moved through corridors unseen, weaving networks of intelligence, speaking in whispers to those who lingered in alleys and taverns, rooting out the remnants of betrayal still festering in the shadows. He became the shield I did not wear, the blade I did not draw, the unseen hand that made it possible for me to stand unbroken in the light. Yet every time our paths crossed, when his eyes found mine across the council chamber, or in the quiet of midnight halls, I felt the truth that we had built our reign together. Though the world only saw one crown, it rested on both of us. Still, the horizon never stayed empty. Rumors drifted across borders like storm clouds on the wind. Foreign armies, hearing whispers of Valandor's return, began to stir, their leaders debating whether to see my crown as a promise of stability or a challenge to their own ambition. Maps spread across council tables grew crowded with markers of enemy movements, and though I held my voice steady, my heart whispered that our kingdom's dawn